If you want to become a legend, a master, the best of the best at any given skill, at any given task, at any given thing that you set out to do, you have to put in 10,000 hours. I'm sure you've heard that idea. It was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell well over a decade ago. So the whole idea of the 10,000 hour rule has become really popularized. And it's easy to understand why, because it makes sense. It makes sense that if you really want to become the best of the best and have that deep knowledge and have that muscle memory and be able to just have the pattern recognition that's required to cut through all the noise and get to the heart of any given thing, to be the master, to be the best at it, you have to have clocked the time. You have to have put in the wrench time. You have to have put in the practice and the effort. And 10,000 hours, my gosh, that will separate the men from the boys, won't it? That will separate the masters from the apprentices, won't it? Now, today's guest actually wants to challenge all of that. And before I introduce James Altucher, a name you may well know, let me take a step back and share why this is a bit of a special episode. So for new listeners, you may not know that the How to Sell More podcast is actually my fourth podcast. I've been podcasting for 8 or 9 years now. And so every once in a while, I like to go back through the archives of past conversations I've had with some really amazing guests. And every once in a while, I think, this would be an amazing conversation to share with the listeners of How to Sell More. And so that's what the team and I here have done. Today's conversation with James Altucher, who is a top 10 LinkedIn influencer, the co-founder of 20 companies, including really significant exits. He's a venture capitalist, an advisor for over 30 companies, spanning a ton of different sectors. He's the author of Wall Street Journal best-selling books. He is a comedian. He's the host of a podcast that's been downloaded over 12 million times. He's written for the Financial Times and Forbes and the Wall Street Journal and TechCrunch and the Huffington Post. He is on a mission to help entrepreneurs and business leaders really embrace unconventional strategies and use experimentation to help achieve success faster, more efficiently than kind of doing the old school ways. So really a fascinating man, a really, really smart thinker, and someone who was on a previous podcast of mine to talk about his latest book at the time, Skip the Line. And in his book, Skip the Line, he suggests that it's not about the 10,000 hours. The 10,000 hours is great, but it takes a really long time and it's what everyone is doing. And so if you want to get to where you want to go faster and better and sidestep all of the traditional slow approaches that everyone else is doing with 10,000 hours, it's not about 10,000 hours. But if you want to skip the line, it's in fact about 10,000 experiments, 10,000 at-bats, 10,000 tries. And so this conversation I had with him, I thought was extremely relevant for today and extremely timely. And I'd love to share it with you. And so with that, we're going to get into this very special episode of the How to Sell More podcast, sales podcast for non-sales people, where each week we give a masterclass to help ambitious B2B leaders like you tackle the biggest challenge that every business owner and every sales team and every marketing team faces, and that is, how do we grow revenue? So I'm Mark Drager. Let's get into it.
At the end of your book, you actually talk about the lessons that you give your kids, and perhaps they're a collection of things from your past books, but there are a few that stuck out at me. In the essence of Skip the Line, the first one is always go to the place least crowded. That's your number one out of all of these great lessons at the end of the book. Why is that the thing? And perhaps it's even, again, the essence of Skip the Line, but why is that the thing that you recommend people do?
Well, if you go, let's say, this is a very interesting question. I've been thinking a lot even recently about this and thinking of new ideas with it. Look at like the story of Betamax and VHS. So for people who don't know, VHS was a tape like that you'd put into
do we have to describe what a VHS tape is?
I think we do, because I don't know if my kids, well, I guess my kids have used VHS, but never, but when they were little.
My kids used to call them those black square DVDs. That's what they used to call them.
Yeah, and but there was a technology at the time that was better. I always think about that story because it's not good enough to be better at something. You have to, nobody knows the difference between 10% better. Let's say Ernest Hemingway is a 10% better writer than F. Scott Fitzgerald, no matter how you measure it, even though I don't know how you would measure that. Or even let's just say something which could be ranked. Let's say somebody's a 10% tennis player than someone else. And that you can rank. There's a ranking system. So you can see by the ranking system that so-and-so is 10% better. But if I were watching them play against other people, not against each other, where you could tell again, but I would not be able to tell the difference between the number 1 tennis player in the world and the number 100 tennis player in the world. There would be no way for me as a, let's call it as a civilian in tennis, there would be no way for me to determine who is better. And I think that's true for most things. It's not good enough to be 10% better. You have to also be different. And that you could tell. If someone has a two-handed forehand and is just winning every game, I'll say, oh, that's unusual and different. Or if someone was a comedian but always raps his jokes, I would say, oh, that's different. And so you have to be different, I think, to succeed. And that's why, and you only get to be different if you, first off, you have to know completely the history and styles. You have to study the mechanics of whatever industry you're in, whether it's business or comedy or writing or whatever. And then you have to have a unique approach that no one else has ever done. Now, you can start off just trying to get good at the basic skills, but eventually, if you want to succeed and be outstanding and be known, it's not, you don't have to be 10% better than everyone else. You have to have at least one thing that's very different than everyone else. And that's really important.
When I was, I had this thought a bunch of years ago, but I tell it to younger people now who are starting businesses, that when you graduate, let's say you graduate high school or you graduate college or whatever, you're entering your career, all you want is to be as good as everyone else. Like when you start something new, and this is what people fall into. They go, I'm just as good as them. Why aren't they picking me? Right? Like you just desperately want to be seen as good as everyone else. And then you hit a point where you're like, oh, I want to be better than everyone else. And then you spend all of this effort trying to make yourself different than everyone else. The advice I give, and I don't know the tools yet, but I think they're in here in the book, is just leapfrog that whole idea of trying to be like everyone else. Get the courage up to be different right from the start. You're going to make mistakes, but you're going to make mistakes anyway. And being like everyone else feels like forward momentum. And yet all you're doing is just moving yourself into kind of that mediocre or middle position. Like there's no reason to pick you. There's no reason to like you. There's no reason to do anything. You're not different.
Yeah. And think about like a writer like Kurt Vonnegut, for instance. Kurt Vonnegut's a great writer, but what really is appealing to him is that he really is different from everyone else. Like his writing style is extremely different. He's got
I don't know that writer. What makes him different?
Kurt Vonnegut. He wrote a book, Cat's Cradle. He wrote Slaughterhouse-Five. He wrote all these like interesting little books. But he says, though, his advice to writers is first learn the rules of grammar and then get different than everyone else. So, because first you have to know the basic skills. Like Steve Jobs had to know what a phone was, and then he made a smartphone. It's very interesting, actually, using this as an example. Now I think about it. First off, the iPhone is 99% of the architecture of an iPhone is a phone. It's just basically, it's a phone. Yes. It's not like a new kind of phone. It communicates the exact same way as every other phone on the planet. And then there are some new things in it. Like it's a music player, it's a video player. You can play games on it now. So all of this stuff is important. But what made the iPhone so successful was, the first thing is that it was very different. There was a lot of things different about it. And the second thing is Steve Jobs' personality. He had this amazing personality for launching these products, that's even a chapter in the book. It's not good enough to, like a lot of people write books, here's how to learn something. It's not good enough to just learn something. Like you said, you have to be different, but also you have to know how to present things. You have to know how to persuade people that your idea is interesting and that they should take a chance on you. So there's a lot that goes into success. It's not just learning the skills, it's being part of that ecosystem and learning it and knowing what's needed. And then, of course, having that persuasion ability, having that mystique, having like the Steve Jobs magic. He would describe a product and everybody be like, ooh, ooh. And then you'd think he's done. And then he'd say, but there's one more thing. And that would be like,
there's one more thing. Yeah. And people would clap towards the end of his life because they knew something magical was coming.
Yeah, and it always was. I mean, look, I have an iPhone, and I didn't for a while, but I finally got one, and it's like the best thing ever.
So if I can ask, and I have to reference this because I won't remember all the words. I usually try to remember these things, but the thought of putting yourself out there and doing things differently and breaking social norms and, not following the path that all the comedians say of first you're going to start with this, and then you're going to do 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes becomes 8 and all of this stuff. You want to skip the line. But you reference here 2 books that you speak to about risk. The books are Fooled by Randomness. Oh, sorry. I guess there's a few. The Black Swan, Anti-Fragile, and Skin in the Game.
Yeah, and Fooled by Randomness also, yeah.
What is it about those books, and what is it about risk that has shaped the way that you approach things? Because again, you seem like the kind of guy who's pretty comfortable with these things.
That's just it. I don't like risk at all. Everyone says, "Oh, but you're a risk taker." I hate. I've gotten broke many times. Like my first company, I sold it. I had money for the first time in my life. I mean, I grew up with no money, and I had money for the first time in my life, and I had millions of dollars. And then within a year or two, I was dead fucking broke. Like I had $143 left to my name.
And you sold it in the 90s for 15 million, right?
Yeah. And then I was...
It's a lot of money to move through.
Yeah, I was the worst on the planet. And I got so depressed, and that's a whole other story. But here's the thing. And it happened to me again and again and again. I've gone broke like 4 times after making money. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? And so there was a lot of things going on. But one thing was my attitude towards risk is that with anything worth doing, the rewards are there. Like if you say, I'm going to invest in the stock market, a lot of people have made a lot of money in the stock market. Like the rewards, we know the rewards are there in the stock market. If you're a writer, the rewards are there as a writer. There's many successful writers. If you're an entrepreneur, the rewards are there. But most people, they know the rewards are there. They know, oh my God, this is my big chance. I'm going to make a lot of money, this. But they don't take into account at all risk. And once you know the rewards are there, that's okay. That's 1% of the path. The other 99% is completely about mitigating risk. That's it.
Mitigating risk.
Getting rid of all the risk. Mm-hmm. And the idea is if you can stay in the game, you're going to win the game. And if you're like, oh my God, I heard about this stock, I'm going to put everything I own into it because now's finally my chance to make it big. If that's your attitude, that almost sounds like that you're a risk taker, you have an abundance mindset, but actually it's the opposite. You have a scarcity complex in that you think this is my only chance to make money, so I got to put everything into it. And you're not really taking into account risks. And it's not like you're a risk taker. You don't even know what the risks are. And so, for instance, with investing, you got to do due diligence before you invest in something. With everything in life, let's say you're starting a business. Why should anybody in the world pay attention to your business and not the 6,000 other successful businesses in this area or whatever it is? So risk is always by far the most important thing you can do to manage mastery, to manage getting good at something. And,
but having had these ups and downs and all of these wildly different experiences, how do you manage risk now?
Well, so for instance, I always assume the stupidest person I know. Like without a doubt, I never make the mistake of thinking I'm smart at what I'm trying to do, whether it's comedy or investing or entrepreneurship. So like as an example, since I've started thinking about this in this way, I've been a very successful investor. It's like that's how I make most of my living and money. And here's how I do it. I won't invest in something unless someone smarter than me is investing at the same time as me. And so I remember my first big deal that I made a lot of money on. I invested in 2007, and it was a company that did Facebook marketing for big Fortune 500 companies. And I wouldn't have invested. I knew the CEO. He was a friend of mine. I wouldn't have invested except for the fact that Peter Thiel, who was the first investor in Facebook, was also investing at the same deal terms as me. So I figured, okay, he knows Facebook better than anyone. This is a Facebook-related company. So he must have done his due diligence. He likes this. Worst case is he could probably convince Facebook to buy it. So I'll invest. So every company I invest in, there has to be someone smarter than me who's done a lot more work on the topic than me investing as well. So that's how I mitigate the risk. Like if Warren Buffett was investing in a company, what am I going to do? Am I going to say, Warren, you're such an idiot. Like, how could you invest in this company? Warren. No, I don't even need to know what the company does, and
but their risk tolerance might be higher than you because they just have more cash on hand, or they're willing to do riskier things than you. I mean,
absolutely,
you're putting a lot of trust in outsourcing your decision making.
You're absolutely right, and it's funny. A lot of people don't bring that up, but that is a risk to taking this approach, is that they don't care if they lose that much money. So you have to get a sense. Well, do they care, and why do they like this? Because sometimes there's a lot of reasons. people might care about. Like sometimes it's just, are they doing a favor for a friend? But most of the time, these guys are billionaires because they really care a lot about squeezing every dollar out of everything. But yeah, I have to take that into account, and I have to look, is this a risk in doing this deal? Is that they don't really care? So it's all about risk management. The rewards are always there, but you win when you take into account all the risks. That's the important point.
You know what? This is a much smaller example, but I got laser eye surgery a few years ago, and I would typically be afraid to do something like that. I went to my sister and said, hey, you've looked into this. Which organization, what type of laser eye surgery would you do? She said this. And I asked another person, they said the same thing. I asked another person, they said the same thing. So I just booked. And I went in, they said, do you have questions? I said, no. They said, do you want to know about us? I said, no. Like I asked 3 people in my life, and all 3 people said this. So this is what I'm doing, and it costs what it costs. When can we book it? And they were so confused because I just, rather than worry about it and do all the research, I trust these 3 people. So I'm just going to do what they say. And it saved a lot of time.
Yeah, it does save a lot of time. Everything is about energy also. So like if I'm going to spend a lot of time researching some deal when Peter Thiel's already in it, so what am I going to do that he hasn't already done? Or Warren Buffett's in it, so what am I going to do? That's a waste of energy. I could be writing, for instance. I could be improving my life in some way. I could be getting better at things. And, everything is about energy. Yeah, we know for a fact we have a finite amount we begin the day with a limited amount of energy. And when we run out of it, we fall asleep again till the next day. So to be great at something, to be the top 1% in the world at something, you need a lot of energy. So if you spend some of that energy filled with anxiety, filled with you're arguing with your spouse, you're sick in bed because you haven't been so healthy lately. If you spend your energy on the wrong things, when it comes time to getting good at this incredibly difficult thing to get good at, and anything worth getting good at is incredibly difficult to do, almost by definition, or else everybody would be doing it. If you spend all your energy on these other things, you won't be as good as the person who is fully ready to devote their energy to getting great at this activity. And by the way, that's the reason you need to be passionate or obsessed with what you want to master. It's not about like, oh, it's so nice to do what you love doing. It's all about energy. Like I am never going to get up on a stand-up stage if I don't absolutely love this, because it is the worst thing in the world. Like it is not. But that's another misconception people have. Oh, but I love doing it. And why do you love doing it? It makes me happy. No, it doesn't. Anything worth doing will not make you happy. But again, by definition, you'll be miserable most of the time. If you're the U.S. junior tennis champion, for instance, and you want to get better at tennis, you are going to be a very unhappy guy or a woman, because you're going to lose while you're getting better. You're going to lose most of your matches, or at least 50% of your matches, because you keep moving up the ladder. First, you move up the ladder very quickly, and then you reach the level of your strongest competition, and now you start losing. And losing is horrible. It's the worst feeling if you love something. Oh, I'm obsessed with tennis and now I'm losing. So you've got to love what you're doing. You got to be able, you might say to yourself after you lose a match, I hate this. I'm never going to do it again. But the next morning you wake up and you're like, you know what? I know what I did wrong. I'm going to get back on that court today and practice it, because you love it. And you don't have to spend energy convincing yourself, oh God, I got to go back to the court again. You don't need that energy. Everybody else who's a loser will need that energy, but you will have the energy to go forward with the things you love. And that's why if you love something, you'll be better than the person who doesn't love it and needs to use part of their energy convincing themselves, I got to sit down and write a novel. I want to write a novel so girls will like me. And that person won't succeed.
Okay.
That might be a good initial motivation, by the way, but you need to ultimately love it. And you only learn that by doing it. You can't learn if you love it if you don't do it.
I love talking to you so much. One of my biggest fears is always like, why put in the effort of getting that body that you want when you just know it's going to disappear as you get older? Why put in the effort of hitting X achievement when in the future you might look back and think, hopefully you've achieved bigger and better. But just to know this, like, hey, 23 years ago, I did this. I put 4 months of effort in, and I think I'm back to where I am. I mean, we could apply that to all kinds of areas of our life.
Oh, yeah. That's why I wrote the book, Skip the Line, because even in chess, the 10,000 hour rule, Malcolm Gladwell popularized it in the book Outliers. And it's this idea that, and I'm sure your listeners have heard of it, but it's this idea that if you really want to be if you really want to master something, you need to spend 10,000 hours of what's called deliberate learning, getting good at it. And this was like paralyzing me, particularly when it came to comedy, because I was already like, I'm 53 now, I was like 46 years old. And I'm like, how am I going to put 10,000 hours into comedy to be, as good as other people who I admire? And I realized, and by the way, I was part of the initial experiments in the early 90s where Anders Ericsson developed the 10,000 hour rule, because I was a chess master and he did a lot of studies on the difference between amateurs, masters, and grandmasters. And the grandmasters spent 10,000 hours, the masters spent, X amount of hours, and the amateurs did nothing. And I'm like, this is crazy. I'm not going to spend 10,000 hours now. I'm 46 years old. I'm not going to be 80 years old when I finally get good at something. And so that's really what led to this book, because I started thinking, well, what about all the other times I didn't spend 10,000? And A, I'm not trying to be in the top 10 in the world. I'm just trying to be in the top 1%, which is very different. So it's less hours. But B, I realized through the use of experiments, like for instance, felt like when I started comedy, I felt like my one-liners were not so good. And so I did an experiment. I went on a subway car, and every stop I did stand up. I went to a different car and on the subway, the New York City subway system, and I would do comedy to the audience. So it was an experiment in dealing with a hostile audience. You can't get more hostile than the New York City subway.
Yeah.
And B, they're all getting off the subway every stop. So I had to have really tight one-liners.
Yeah.
And so that was an experiment I did to see if it would help me get better. The great benefit of experiments is, as opposed to waiting for the next time I'm on stage and then taking the risk that, oh, I'm going to bomb because I'm practicing one-liners for the first time, so they're never going to book me again. And you have to be respectful of the booker and the business and so on. And, it was a good way to skip the line on one-liners. I got immense practice right away doing one-liners. And I don't want to say if I got good at it that moment, but I certainly got years and years worth of effort better, because I performed like 20 times to 20 different groups of hostile audiences, just a bunch of one-liners.
Turning over every few stops.
And by the way, I would make them up on the fly. That was another thing I was practicing. So I did this like experiment. People think, oh, do you need money to do experiments? No, that cost me like $1.25, whatever the cost of a subway token was. And that was it. And what was my downside? So an experiment is easy to set up, which this was, just go to the subway. It's easy to set up. It's cheap. There's little downside. Like, what was my downside? Is that a bunch of people in a subway would hate me. And that's my downside, which is not, I don't care. Like, that's not so bad. And my upside was enormous, which is that I'm going to be amazing at one-liners. Now, neither happened. Like, I experimented, even failed. I wasn't really that good at one-liners, but at least it got me better, and it got me thinking about it, and it put me in a difficult situation where I would learn to be better. And so the experiment, and by the way, a great thing about experiment is it's a story for the rest of your life. I just told you the story, and it's a great story. People are like, I can't believe you did that. And so experiments usually are interesting stories to tell later, even if they fail. There was no downside. There was infinite upside. And I had such a fun time doing it. I then said, you know what? This reminds me of a late night show, but on a subway. So whenever you do a cover of a song, if you're a musician and you want to do a cover of a song, you take the entire song and you change one element. So let's say I want to do a cover of Coolio's Gangster's Paradise. How about, what if I do it in a 1920s type of honky-tonk format? That's a legit cover. Or let's say I want to do Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. Let's say, Freddie Mercury sings 8 different octaves in Bohemian Rhapsody. So what if I have 8 different people, 8 different women sing a different octave? Like when Freddie Mercury was singing this octave, I have this one. When Freddie Mercury was singing this octave, I have this one. So that's a cover changes one thing, and it does it really well. So I was thinking to myself, I can make a late night show where the one thing I change is I'm going to be on a subway. So I found a busker who played like garbage cans as drums, and he was my musical guest. And then I had a friend of mine who had just written a book as my, guest that I would interview. And there was some audience interaction. It took me like half a day. So very little downside, easy to set up, no money. And I made like a whole late night show episode on the subway. And then I figured, okay, I'm just going to send this. It doesn't hurt. I'm going to just send this to an agent and see what they think. And so I did that. And he didn't care about it. He didn't like it. And so experiments fail, but you don't. But look, what was the upside was, oh my gosh, it cost me nothing, and I learned a lot. By the way, I produced a show there, and I learned about late night shows, and this started my thinking about making covers of things, and I learned a lot more about comedy, of course, because I did the monologue was what my one-liners part was, and my upside was, oh my gosh, I have a TV show on late night on NBC. That was my upside. Didn't work out that way, but you always learn something, and it's a story, and it's fun, and it's experience. Every experience teaches you something about life. So that was that.
Amazing. Last question, real quick, because we only have a minute left. What's your favorite part of this book? I know that you wrote it a year ago, a little over that.
Yeah, no, but I read
it always,
every day.
There's always a fresh thing. So what's your favorite thing out of the book?
I think the overall favorite thing is that it proved to me, and it's still proving to me, that you can get good at something you thought was impossible to get good at for whatever reason. And other people told you can't get good at this, or you can't skip the line. You get really good at difficult things very fast. And you not only that, you can learn how to monetize it. And I've seen people do it. I've seen people use the techniques in this book to do exactly that. But the favorite technique maybe, well, there's one chapter about persuasion that I really like. I just enjoyed, these are all techniques that I've personally used, whether it's the persuasion techniques. Like I see a lot of bullshit books about persuasion, like, oh, if you cross your legs when they cross their legs, they start listening to everything you say. I've tried all that. It doesn't work. So these techniques actually work for me, and they're still working for me. Like I say, I apply it to chess, which is an incredibly difficult game, and already I'm as good as I ever was before. But I like the idea of, my favorite chapter is probably the 10,000 experiment rule. The idea that you can beat out the 10,000 hour rule through this technique of experiments. That's incredibly valuable to know. And I didn't realize that for a long time. And I was so stressed. Oh, I got to spend 10,000 hours to get good at this. And it just wasn't true. And experiments was a much more valuable and correct way to get good at something.
So that was the conversation that I had with James Altucher. To wrap up, I'm going to share my 3 biggest takeaways from this talk. Number 1, you cannot ignore the power of differentiation. Being different is vital. You need to be different, not simply better. And James emphasized this point because in any field, it's not enough to just be marginally better than the competition. In my experience, so many of us business owners and sales and marketing people just want to prove that we are better. Better, it's not enough. But different, whether that's through style or approach or execution, that is really the key for standing out. And if you and your company are struggling to differentiate and to stand out in a competitive market, you can reach out to me. You can drop me a note on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me by email. My contact details in the show notes. We can jump on a call and I can help point you in the right direction. Because what I don't really talk about too much on the podcast is my agency Sales Loop, a brand strategy company that helps B2B business owners exactly with that. Key lesson number 2, when you are facing some hard decisions, when you are focused on strategy, mitigating risk is the most important thing. James explained that while the rewards of any venture are often really clear, the key to success lies in really understanding and mitigating risk. He stressed the importance of aligning with smarter or more experienced people when making these really key decisions. And I mean, he shared that through his investment strategy, but I know it's true for me that often when I am being too risk averse, I feel like I'm missing out on opportunities, like I'm moving too slow, like I'm missing out. Maybe I should be a little bit more greedy. Yet when things go sideways and wrong, oh my goodness, am I happy that I was more conservative and risk averse. And that is where long-term success comes from. And key lesson number 3, you can accelerate your learning through the 10,000 experiment rule. So yeah, right off the top, we talked about challenging the 10,000 hour rule. James introduces this concept of, it's about 10,000 experiments, 10,000 at-bats. You have to conduct a series of focused experiments so that way you can achieve mastery faster and more efficiently than just putting in the time. So there you have it. Those were my 3 biggest takeaways from this talk, but I'm curious, what were yours? Anything challenge your perspective? Let's dive deeper into this over on LinkedIn, where I share more insights and I love to spark conversation. I am Mark Drager. You can find my contact details in the episode show notes. Now, while you're over on LinkedIn, be sure to follow James for more creative and amazing content. You can also check out more about his work over at jamesaltucher.com. You can listen to his podcast, The James Altucher Show. It's on Instagram and YouTube and Facebook and everywhere. One last thing. If you made it this far into the show, you really should subscribe, because every week we share even more strategies and actionable tips, just like what James shared with us today, to help boost sales and grow your company. And one more last thing. As I mentioned earlier, if you need any kind of help with differentiation, standing out from the competition, branding, marketing messages, the kinds of things that we spoke about today to make sure that you come across as different and not just better, go ahead and drop me a message, a DM. Let's connect for a conversation. With that, I'm Mark Drager. Thank you so much for listening in, and I will catch you in the next episode.